Thank you very much. As he just said, when someone asks, "How you doing, Newman?" you could see Neil with that little grin on his face, and he said, "Oh, I never had it so good." That was Neil. That was a genuine. He really loved his life. We all know he grew up working on the family farm and ranch and the homestead. Later on in high school, he went to work on a farm and ranch for Ida Andrews outside of Torrington. He had some good memories of working for her, but after this job, he told his dad he didn't want to be a rancher. Neil found he was good with his hands, and he made a commitment to the construction trade. While still in high school with his friend Gary Childs, they started the drywall business. They got along real well here locally and up in Casper, and then expanded all over the state. There were some tough times for those guys at a young age in business, and he and Gary got through those lean times by effectively managing, harvesting a sustainable crop of antelope. They happily survived on the fresh meat. He had a great time in high school and college. He liked to play baseball and he liked to play basketball. He was a very competitive sports player. And he had one of his best friends, Kevin Merrill, who had moved up to Douglas, where they would come to town to play the local team, and they found a very competitive game in which they'd play together and had a good time. But then when it was over, Neil would come up to Kevin and say, "We still going pheasant hunting this Sunday?" Yep, sure enough, they'd come down and go pheasant hunting. While a real competitor, Neil really cherished his friendship with his friends. Back in the mid-20s, or in his mid-20s, Neil went back to school. He went to EWC and he went to the University of Wyoming. Neil was a very educated fella. He sought to increase his knowledge by any means he could. He researched and he studied and he gathered the facts on things. And he was a very diverse person. He had a lot of diverse interests. He could do drywalling and he could build a cabin in the woods and obviously hunt and fish and had a good time. And he was always knowledgeable and always involved in a lot of the local and state business and political issues. He just liked to be involved in what was going on. And Neil, from a young age, he loved to travel. His trips took him just about most anywhere. Back in the early 80s, I was delivering a brand new airplane from Wichita, Kansas, delivering it up to Fairbanks, Alaska. It was a Cessna 207. It had a lot of room in it, a lot of empty space. So I had stopped into Torrington here to visit the family and talking to Neil about it. He said, "I've never been to Alaska." I said, "Well, I got the room. Why don't you come along?" So he and Kayleen did that. They got in the airplane and we went to Alaska. Had a good time. I think we made it in about, I think it was 2 days, 2 long days of flying. The first day we get into Canada and we had to clear customs. And it was some Canadian holiday. I don't remember exactly which one it was, but there was no customs official there. We had to wait for them, and we had to pay extra for the customs official to clear us. Well, that turned out not to be near as big a problem as Neil's having to go to the bathroom. And when you go into another country, you do not leave the vehicle you're in until they tell you to, so he couldn't do anything. He just had to sit there and hold it until they showed up. I told him to go before we left. The first night we spent up in Watson Lake in the Yukon Territory, and the terminal was, it's about 20 miles out of town, so there was no real way to get to town. Uber hadn't been invented yet, so we just spent the night on the benches there in the terminal building at Watson Lake. And the sun's up around the clock in the summertime there, so it was light all the time. So we got an early start the next morning and made it on into Fairbanks. They stayed with us for a couple of days there. They had a good time. They enjoyed the sights and the scenery and visiting and all that. Another form of travel that Neil was really accustomed to was he used to like to hitchhike all over as a younger fellow. There was one day he was down in Colorado trying to get back to Wyoming, and he's got his thumb out, and this older guy pulls up He's got Wyoming plates. He's got 7 county Wyoming plates on. So Neil figures, hey, I'm in. Get all the way home. Neil gets in the back seat in this car, and the driver and the hitchhiker didn't know each other initially until Neil studied him in the back of his head and realized it was his dad, Keith Newman. So and I think Neil said something to the effect, hi Dad, or something like that. When Keith finally figured out what it was, I guess he kind of came unglued and kind of lectured Neil in a Keith Newman sort of way on the dangers of hitchhiking. Well, Neil turned around and, being Neil, told his dad about the dangers of picking up hitchhikers. So there's some similarities there. Neil really enjoyed being business, and he understood it well. He was always a real early riser, and he never stopped dreaming of projects. And he didn't rest until they were finished. And he had not really given thought to slowing down because hard work was such a high value to Neil. He respected others for their contributions in creating and building and at any level and in their own way. So Neil was in no hurry. He had lots of projects, and he just kept coming up with new ones. And it's evident by the projects that he's been involved in, as you can see around town, the impact that he's had on the community and what have you. People relied on his advice, and he was respected and trusted. He was a mentor to others, and he would make the effort to himself learn a new skill or a new trade. And after he learned it, he would freely pass that information on to whomever wanted to learn something new. He liked to help others become better. People would call or stop by the office for advice or just come in to chat. And Neil was always one who was in the know of what was going on and in the business community, and he had his finger on the pulse, if you will, of what was going on. One of his first residential development projects was the old church over on the southwest side of town, which he eventually turned into a fourplex. Alice and I rented from him for a time right after we got married. The project started out, however, with a little bit of resistance from the neighborhood. They didn't want an apartment building going in their neighborhood. So Neil had bought this building, which was a former church, and now it's vacant. And he cannot, the neighbors resisted, and so the city would not issue him a building permit. So he's sitting there with this building, nothing to do with it. So he rents it out to this group that has dances in there. So at night they would have their dances and loud music and the windows open all night. And I guess it didn't take long and there was no longer a problem with the neighbors turning it into an apartment building. For over 40 years, Neil operated High Plains Construction, and he was a partner in Signature Homes with his wife, Deidre. Several years ago, he and Deidre were in the office together, and a fax comes in. Some law firm in Casper or someplace. It was, this is back when faxes were, some of you don't even know what a fax is. But it was telling him, it was from a law office up there, and it said, cease and desist in using the name High Plains Construction. You're in violation of whatever. You know, most of us would be like, oh no, what do we do now? You know, we've got this threatening letter, legal letter. Neil takes the paper, turns it over, grabs a bold marker, and on the back he writes, I've been in business for 35 years. I've been incorporated with the Secretary of State for 20 years. I spell it differently. You should have paid attention in law school. Facts right back. Of course, Neil and Deidre never heard from them again. Neil lived the work hard, play hard kind of life. He worked just as hard during his time away from a job as he did while he was on a job. He always had something to fix. I mean, whether it was watering something or improving something, Neil was always busy. And when he made a decision to do something, he would do it, and he would not look back. And he would look forward, not backwards. And if there was a problem, he would work around the problems, and they would make it work out. He was always quick with accolades and praise for others that did a good job. And he was quick to call out those that were unfair or for wrongdoing. And when he knew the truth. And he was not what you'd call a yes man. Every time Neil got a new pickup, he'd say, I have to take care of this truck. It's the last one my mom's going to buy me. But everybody knew that was a joke. All his life, he bought his own vehicles. Years ago, Neil told his brother Ross that the definition of success is when you have your estate sale and it takes 2 days with lunch. Ross says that Neil had some tools and some things that he hasn't even borrowed yet. When Neil and Deidre decided to get married, Deidre was involved in cattle ranching at the time, and she had her own cow herd. And Neil, having given up on agriculture at an early age, and not wanting any more to do with cows, insisted on a no-cow dowry. Well, the family is forever grateful that she loved Neil more than she loved her cows. And Neil was not always all work and no play. He enjoyed all Wyoming had to offer. He'd go fishing with his friend Mike Callahan quite often, and every time they went fishing, they had a bet. Who caught the first fish, who caught the biggest fish, and who caught the most fish. So that should be a $3 bet. And Neil never once paid his debt, according to Mike. But he did buy dinner a lot, so he wasn't shirking on the bet all the time. Neil loved the outdoors, as we all know, and some of his happiest times were in the mountains near Cody. He loved the beauty, the physical challenges, and the connection with Wyoming's rugged history. For the man who was always in motion, there, time stood serenely still. And he loved most of all going fishing with his son, Paul. They fished a lot of places around, and we were trying to make a list of all it was, and it was just an awfully long list, so we just said everywhere. He was a supporter of the Wyoming club baseball team and Cowboy Joe club supporter, and he was an avid baseball fan of the Colorado Rockies when they moved to Denver. They became season ticket holders and would take in as many games as they could. During probably the first season down there, they had a seat. Their seats were behind a row of seats. This row had a bar in front of them, and then there's a level down below them. And there was always some drunks sitting in those seats. Neil and Deidre would be sitting behind him. And this fellow sitting in front of them, every time somebody would hit the ball, a pop fly or a foul ball, this drunk would get up thinking that he could catch this ball. Of course, it's clear over the other side of the field. But every time he got up, he spilled his beer over the people down below, and he was obnoxious and bothersome. So about the third time doing this, Neil grabs him by both shoulders and slams him down, as Neil could do. Deidre thought he really injured the guy. The guy sat there, and didn't move for the longest time. Finally, he turned around sheepishly and said, "Can I go to the bathroom?" I think Neil said, "Make it quick." As you all know, Neil always wore his University of Wyoming cap. UW, Wyoming cowboy cap. In the pictures of, let's see, at Demity's wedding in California, at Lindsay's wedding reception in Nebraska, which is enemy territory for UW, he proudly had his new University of Wyoming cap on, the one without sweat stains. It's in all the pictures, as we all know. He'd wear that cap proudly wherever they went. He and Deidre would be off on their travels all over the place, and somebody would inevitably ask him about the hat, thinking it was Wisconsin or Washington or something, and Neil would set them straight where it was. And by the time the conversation was over, he'd made a new friend. That's the kind of person Neil could be. And friends, Neil had a lot of them. He fit the best friend category to many people. He was extremely fond of his crew, Leland, Roberto, and Sam, which, by the way, they did the nice wildlife display that's in the back of the room back there, that some of the animals that Neil and Greg pursued up at hunting camp. There's trees and buckets here. Some of you know that Neil was an avid tree planter. Everywhere they went, somewhere Neil would plant trees. And it's kind of a moist spring. Maybe it's a good time of year to plant some trees, so we encourage you to go out and maybe in Neil's honor, plant a tree, because I think that's what he would do. It's been a great effort this past week by all the friends and family members to go through this and yet pull all this together. I'm proud to be part of this family for 40 years. Neil and I had a profound conversation just this past Easter. We had Easter dinner at Ross and Julie's house. Afterwards, I was kind of looking for a nap, so I went downstairs, and Neil had beat me to it. He was down there on the recliner. There was another recliner right next to him, so I got in that one. And with our eyes closed and kind of resting our eyes there, we were having this little conversation back and forth, until pretty soon Alice was nudging me, telling me it was time to go. So I'll sure miss having those visits with Neil, and I know we'll all miss him very much. Thank you.